My So-Called Life wasn't just the best-reviewed teen show on TV in 1994, it was one of the only teen shows on TV, and helped to kickstart a 90s youthquake on screen. With its gritty realism and willingness to dive straight into the more uncomfortable, sometimes dark parts of being a teenager, it set the stage for later hits like Euphoria.
I'm always doing that. I'm always asking questions I already know the answer to.
The show made a huge impact, despite only having one single season, because even in its short time on air, it managed to really connect with the new generation that was struggling to find its place in the world and truly be understood.
It's the year 2000. That's the theme. Just what it'll be like.
So let's take a deeper look at what specifically made My So-Called Life so monumental and relatable, and how it made way for new voices to be heard. One of the most distinctive elements of My So-Called Life at the time, and something that's gone on to become a staple of the genre, is its use of voiceover narration to allow us inside the mind of the protagonist.
Does anybody know Jordan Catalano?
Does anybody know Jordan Catalano? That question, got to me.
Angela Chase, the moody 15-year-old girl played by Claire Danes, narrates bits and pieces of almost every episode.
Things were getting to me. Just how people are. How they always expect you to be a certain way.
Angela's narration was crucial to the vibe of the show for a number of reasons. It lends the show immediacy. Of course, My So-Called Life was not the first piece of adolescent media to include voiceover narration. It was also a major component of hits like The Wonder Years, but that show was narrated by an adult looking back on their younger years.
I had assumed my standard homeroom position, drooling in the general direction of Lisa Berlini.
My So-Called Life, on the other hand, used Angela's narration to reflect her current point of view.
Can you give me an example of something Kafkaesque?
Sharon Chersky having a boyfriend. And not me.
It brought the audience inside the head of a contemporary teenager in 1994, really grappling with what it meant to be young in that moment, rather than creating a level of distance by looking back at those years through the lens of nostalgia and hazy memories. It reflects the way that those worlds don't seem separate when you're at that age. Your teenage concerns are the real world to you.
So I started hanging out with Rayanne Graff. Just for fun. Just because it seemed like if I didn't, I would die or something.
It was reflective. Her worldview isn't especially sardonic or ironic, the way that an adult talking about their teen years might be. She's not trying to rewrite her story in hindsight. She's genuinely trying to understand and express her true self in the moment. Her narration functions as a diary, more a place for her to unwind her thoughts than to create action.
It blotted out the rest of my face, the rest of my life. Like the zit had become the truth about me.
It can be difficult to articulate our thoughts and choices, especially when we're young, and so the narration gives Angela a place to do so outside of the scrutiny of those around her, her innermost thoughts that only she and we are privy to. It creates a greater sense of empathy. Having access to Angela's thoughts and feelings makes it easier to empathize with her. And as the show went on, we also got the opportunity to get inside the heads of the other characters too, giving us new insight into their inner worlds.
I became yearbook photographer because I liked the idea that I could sort of watch life without having to be part of it. But when you're yearbook photographer, you're like never in the picture.
One episode features Angela's friend Brian, the nerd with a crush on her.
At Angela's house, they probably laugh and eat unbalanced meals and talk about things that don't have deep symbolic meaning. They're probably this normal family.
Another is narrated by Angela's little sister Danielle.
That was the best weekend of my entire life.
The creators have said that if the show had continued, they would have let other characters continue to narrate for an episode at a time throughout the series.
My whole life is waiting for something to happen.
This framing was so important to the larger impact of the show. None of the characters are villainous, they're all afforded some measure of grace, even when they're behaving carelessly, selfishly, or irritatingly.
I wanted to hug Sharon and tell her things, like how awful I felt. It was like I didn't have the right, because we weren't friends anymore.
My So-Called Life's visual style also helped it to connect with young viewers of the era. Far from the brighter, happier shows it shared the airwaves with, My So-Called Life leaned into the grunge aesthetic of the early 90s in its clothing, slang, music, and filming choices.
What are you wearing?
What? My red flannel shirt and my brown corduroys.
And while it stayed true to its realistic, down-to-earth roots, the show also wasn't afraid to get a little fantastical. The show uses these moments to really highlight how strange and unearthly it can feel to be a teenager. Holidays can be particularly stressful times, and on the show, this is often portrayed by characters encountering some of the show's most out-there elements, like Angela seeing ghosts on Halloween.
Nikki, wait!
Or the appearance of a character who seems to be a real, genuine angel.
So what else do you want to know? How did you die? I froze.
The show's style manages to walk a fine line by being visually heightened without feeling distracting or emotionally disconnected. Using heightened elements to externalize the heightened feelings of teenagerdom are par for the course for teen shows, from Dawson's Creek's characters' hyper self-aware verbosity.
You're just jealous.
You? Yeah, talk about delusions of grandeur.
Dawson, this is so blatant. That's why you threw the basketball in my nose, and it's why you've been acting like such a little puke lately.
To Euphoria's dreamlike visuals, to, well, pretty much everything about Riverdale.
Now Jughead here is going to save Riverdale by becoming a living battery. A, story generator.
While My So-Called Life does on occasion lean into more fantastical elements, everything is always solidly grounded in a very relatable level of realism. These teens are not written to sound like grown adults who always perfectly articulate their thoughts. Quite the opposite. The dialogue can often feel almost painfully true to life, with lots of 90s accurate conversational fillers.
Jordan Catalano doesn't go to school dances, as like policy.
Qualifiers.
Seeing the other person's perfectness. Or something.
And upspeak.
It's what you're supposed to do. Unless you're, like, abnormal.
The stories tend to be pretty simple and actually relatable to everyday teens, with plots focusing on a school dance or a new substitute teacher or decisions about whether to have sex.
I think about it all the time.
Wait, you think about it all the time?
Brian? Yeah, shut up. Boys don't have the monopoly on thinking about it.
They don't?
No.
This combines with those more dreamy elements to show us a world that feels more true to the characters' experiences. And much like the voiceover, My So-Called Life uses these visual elements to reflect the inner lives of the characters. The show frequently uses dream sequences.
In the dream I keep having about Jordan Catalano, I'm trying to catch up with him.
Dreams are so important to the show's aesthetic that the series finale, titled In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, is structured around characters recalling their dreams to each other.
Listen, everyone, you want to hear what I dreamed?
No thanks.
Leaving the audience to do some of the interpretation about what they mean to those characters.
You can't hit a person with something that profound and expect that to be the end of the discussion.
You can't?
But unlike other teen shows where dreams are used for foreshadowing or plotting, here the dreams feel like the real honest dreams of teenagers. The show stays true to the slightly garbled, confusing nature of dreams.
Sometimes my father's there.
Where our psychological hang-ups get remixed into a jumble of anxieties or fantasies.
I dreamed I was taking out the garbage, and suddenly I realized there's someone there, and it's Princess Diana.
The visual style of My So-Called Life effortlessly captures what it means to be a teenager, not by looking like the youth trends of the moment, but by looking like the inside of Angela Chase's head. It treats her character like she's worthy of all this attention, and worth taking seriously as a person, even though, or perhaps because, she's not a fully formed adult just yet.
There's this dividing line between girls who've had sex and girls who haven't. And all of a sudden, we both realized that we were looking at each other across it.
This is a show that understands the fullness of the adolescent experience and extends the empathy and attention teenagers need to the entire cast of characters.
People always say how you should be yourself. Like, yourself is this definite thing. Like a toaster or something.
Though it managed to garner critical acclaim and a devoted following, My So-Called Life was unfortunately not a success in the ratings, and so was canceled after its single 19-episode season. It hasn't been subject to the revival reboot spin-off grinder of streaming yet, and so continues to exist as a perfectly imperfect snapshot of a very specific point in time. But even though it doesn't get all the credit it deserves, the show's legacy of sincerity and empathy lives on.
They're the people you feel this unspoken connection to.
4 years later, Freaks and Geeks appeared at the tail end of the decade, applying a similar sense of realism, empathy, humor, and period-specific texture to the lives of its teen protagonists. Jason Katims, who wrote 3 episodes of My So-Called Life, would go on to bring that same sensibility to shows he executive produced and wrote for, like Roswell and Friday Night Lights. And of course, we can see so much of My So-Called Life's influence in modern-day hits like Euphoria.
Every time I feel good, I think it'll last forever, but it doesn't.
And even less moody fare, like Never Have I Ever, shares My So-Called Life's use of narration to give us a better understanding of how these teens are really feeling.
How could Eleanor have a boyfriend and not tell her about it? And why would she tell Fabiola? Does she think Davy's too unhinged to handle it?
It's easy to overlook the way some of our favorite modern shows have been influenced by My So-Called Life, because on its face, the show feels so of its time. But while the show does capture the 90s perfectly, it's so true to its time period that even watching it now doesn't feel mainly like a nostalgia trip. It wasn't designed to sell some aesthetic, idealized version of the 90s. It was designed to get into its characters' heads and evoke the thoughts, feelings, fantasies, and dreams of an adolescent girl in 1994, which isn't actually all that different from an adolescent girl today. The show, lives in the moment or something.
Sometimes someone says something really small, and it just fits right into this empty place in your heart.
That's The Take. Click here to watch a video we think you'll love, or here to check out a whole playlist of awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And make sure to subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive new videos.